I'm Courtney Cook. I love the Museum of Human Achievement and was just really delighted to be asked to facilitate this panel. I've been learning a lot. I don't know a lot about games or game development, and I've been having some really amazing conversations. I do know I like to read and think and talk a lot about power and structures and masculinity and violence and all of these things that we have to unfortunately talk about sometimes, so that we can imagine other possibilities for a world that we can live in. And that's how I enter this space. So having this conversation today and conversations I've had before today I've just learned a ton, and it's really interesting. So thanks for having me. We are going to start. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm also going to see how far away I can get from the mic. Can y'all hear me? I have to just stay really close. Okay. Let's get close. So we'll start, maybe just go down the table. Jonathan, if you want to start, just tell us who you are.
Sure. My name is Jonathan Levine. I'm a committee member at Game Show Fantastic Arcade, and in addition to that, I'm involved in video game accessibility advocacy, which is the name of it.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Kate Sánchez. I am an editor-in-chief of But Why Though, which is an entertainment outlet that focuses on looking at pop culture and pop culture critique from a marginalized lens and a diverse lens. But in addition to that, I'm also a recruiter at Iron Galaxy Studios, and they do sensitivity rating on this side as well, primarily working in DEA and that type of stuff.
I'm Carmaleta McKinnis-Williams. I am the Equity Inclusion Program Manager for Austin Public Library.
Great panel. Thank y'all for being here. Thank y'all for talking to me ahead of time. I wonder if we can also maybe now just hear a little bit about the work that each of you do, how it intersects with why you found yourself working in games and game development or recruiting. Kind of just give us a little bit about your relationship to this community. We'll start with that question. Who wants to go first? I don't want to make Jonathan go first every time.
Right at me. I'm the least of the gamers, but I'm in this space because I have 3 generations of gamers, from my husband to my son-in-law to my grandsons, and so that puts me into gaming, from an investment for gifts to the time that they take playing the games away from me, right? So that's how I come into the space, as a consumer and a parent and a grandparent, and in terms of what I see, where I see opportunities that we can have in the gaming industry.
Thank you. And I guess I should have introduced the topic of the panel. I'm thinking now, as we talk about the cost of games, and in the conversation I had with Jonathan, we talked about how sometimes the cost of games can be a barrier to access for many. And today we're going to be talking about access. We're going to be talking about accessibility and accountability, and learning from our panelists. So, Kate, would you introduce yourself or talk a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, so I have always loved pop culture. I was in a PhD program here at UT, specifically looking at how the things we read in comic books affect how we look at other people that we may not have met before. I didn't like doing the academic stuff, so I left, and I just wound up in recruiting at Meta for about 5 years. In that process, I didn't want to leave behind the research and the writing and the community building that I had while I was in my doctoral program. So we founded But Why Though, which is a space where we talk about TV, anime, comics, video games, all of it, and really cultivating what the community looks like and what that type of criticism looks like and who's doing it has been really important. So far as winding up, games has always been a passion of mine. Like, I've been a gamer for forever. So it was kind of natural moving from Meta into the games industry. Obviously, I'm a brown woman in the games industry. Not a very easy place to inhabit. But I was also that in tech. Not an easy place to inhabit. I was also that in academia. Not an easy place to inhabit. And so each time that I've progressed my career forward towards where it is now in games, I've learned different ways to help the community that I'm a part of, but also the other represented communities that I've encountered in those spaces. So that brings me to my work now at Iron Galaxy as a recruiter. I run university relations, primarily trying to push our connections with HBCUs and HSIs. You know what an HSI is, it's a Hispanic Serving Institution. And then I also work on diversifying our sourcing strategy as well. So I'm doing a lot of that work of making sure that when we build for the future of game development, we're including everybody at the table. So yeah, that's me in like a nutshell. And like sometimes I read things people build, and I'm like, hey, that's cool, or that's not. And that's a sensitivity reader.
Thank you. All right, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about how you got involved.
Yeah, this is kind of an in for a penny, in for a pound situation because my involvement in accessibility is directly tied to my own disability and my experiences with it as a game. When I'm 49 now, when I was 19, I developed a condition called avascular necrosis. It's a fairly rare condition, and I have it in an even rarer way. Basically, blood vessels in your bones near the joints collapse permanently, and you lose blood flow. And that area of bone dies, never regenerates. It also cuts off blood to the cartilage in your joints. So the cartilage dies, and then basically it's destroyed from friction, and never comes back. From that point on, the bones in the joints just directly mash into each other whenever the joints move. So it ends up for me being, I guess, a semi-invisible disability, because you'll usually see me with a cane, but I can still walk. I'm not usually using other assistive devices, but I have reduced mobility and I have constant chronic pain in both of my ankles and both sides of my hips. And as soon as the effects of the condition kicked in, my life changed very dramatically, because suddenly no more baseball, no more dancing, no more mountain biking, no more bowling. Pretty much all of the activities I had that I felt like had a push-pull effect, a feedback loop, were kind of gone. I love reading, love movies, TV, but there's a passivity to me to those experiences, and there's kind of only so much that you can take. And so, even though I'd always played video games, as I moved into my college years, and we started getting into kind of the PS1 and on era, and games became bigger and more accessible than they ever been before, they blew my mind. And again, my life changed more to the better, because suddenly I had things that I could do that I was in conversation with. It wasn't one way. It was back, it was forth, it was awesome. And as far as my direct play, I am directly affected by my disability because of some cognitive concerns. And if anybody's curious, I can get into that. Any questions? But my hands are unaffected, my upper body is largely unaffected, which means that compared to a lot of other people with disabilities, there's a lot of impacts that other people have that I don't. And having realized how incredibly beneficial to my life being able to play video games is, I got to a point, especially as I got to know people in the development community, where I couldn't not talk about how awesome it is to be able to play games, specifically for people like me, to everyone that would let me. And that's kind of how I got where I am.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate all that you've shared, and you're clearly entering into this space from different points of entry. This will be a great chat. The first question I want to ask, and this is for each of you to answer, is what does accessibility in the game world look like to each of you? I think we can kind of glean a little bit about what that might mean to each of you from what you've shared. But I would also love it, and I think maybe it'd be great for the audience here if we could also have some real specifics. Maybe after you give a general overview, then I'll ask I might have a follow-up question for you after you share. So what does accessibility look like to you in this world?
So accessibility, when I answer that question, I see it from a multi-tiered level, from, abilities, disabilities, that type of, controllers, design, all of those things, costs, those are different entry points of accessibility. And then, of course, access. If you can't afford it, you can't get it, you can't play it, and then in terms of design, programming, who's, being invited to help design, are we thinking about different communities? Are we thinking about elders? They can play games too, are we thinking about, games of faith? We don't even think about that, right? Game changing, right? And so, pun intended, by the way. And are we thinking about education? Are we inviting educators, teachers to the table when we're designing, when we're thinking about it, when we're thinking about the future of gaming? So access has multi-point entry points.
Thank you. Kate?
I'm
gonna ask again, or you
No, I get it. Yeah. I think for me, class is kind of this uniting factor in accessibility because it's about who has access, and not everybody has the same equitable tools to reach it. I've never played a Zelda game. I've never beat a Mario game. Anything on Nintendo, I don't know. But it's because I didn't have the money to have that system when I was younger. So there's a large swath of game history that I've been excluded from because of how much money I had at the time. So for me, when I look at the way that class really impacts everything, it has intersections with disability. It has very large intersections with race. And one of the things that we're looking at is as more people come up within the game development space, you're looking at who has access to play the game to get inspired, to want to play, to make games, who has access to a rig that can actually run the programming to make the game, who has access to tools, who has access to teachers, whose parents will support them to actually become a game developer and not tell them to go be a lawyer or a doctor. And it's all of these compounding factors that I think once you step back and you look at that as kind of the base, it really shows you how we can all move together towards the same point. And so I agree that it's multi-tiered. For me, class just kind of goes up into that piece because I've been excluded from games in a multitude of ways. As a journalist, we're never really the first person at the table. We have to send countless emails, try to get access because we're not IGN, we're not Polygon, we're not the big names, and then a lot of the times I don't look like those other journalists do. So what I say may come off as more aggressive or, and somebody may not necessarily want to put their game in front of me. But when you look at terms of that access, I can still buy the game because I have the income to buy it and play it. So when I'm thinking about accessibility, you have to look at games as who has the ability to create them, who has the ability to cover them, and who has the ability to play them. Because right now, as we look in that journalist sphere, you may not know about an indie game because nobody's talked about it in your circle, and we rely on journalists or content creators to be able to get that word out. There was a thought in there, I hope.
I hope it comes back up. I have a side question. Have people in this room actually beat a Mario game? You raise your hand. Oh my god, that's incredible. I didn't even think you could beat those games. Wow. Cool, thank you for that. And also thank you for this conversation around intersectionality and how that is very much active in this space of gaming. And not only gameplay, I think in your response, it's the same in all the worlds that we inhabit. Access is so much, and so to be introduced to a game at a young age, how would you know that? I mean, I didn't really know. I grew up in the country in Georgia and did not know that I could make games, but the only art school I had was English class, and I think about this often, like to not have access to it or curiosity, to be able to develop a relationship of curiosity, Yeah, I hadn't thought about that until
I mean, and I've seen it like in my own life, because for me, like games was like a thing. Like my first game was Tomb Raider because my mom saved up for a year to buy me a PlayStation. For the life of that console, I had 3 games: Tomb Raider 1, Tomb Raider 2, and Crash Bandicoot. I don't know how that got in there, but my mom bought it because she knew I loved Indiana Jones. But those were my games. My brother, who's 9 years younger than me, he's now studying at Texas Tech in computer software engineering. He was on an esports team there playing Overwatch. Like, he has a multitude of doors open to him. But also because, like, the idea of gaming for our parents has changed, too. Like, my mom still calls everything an Xbox, but, like, she's not calling it Nintendo, so that's progress. And she can see what can be done in that space. So it's amazing, like, when you actually deconstruct games, how many multi-generational families influence where kids can go within that space, and also how important it is to introduce people to the idea of even being able to be in that space.
And I would say something that I've learned in this process too that I didn't know before. You know, when I thought of games as somebody outside of the world, I just kind of had probably these assumptions about, you know, like all the games are like the one with the cars. It's like, I mean, they're just kind of like violent. They're like violent and like with Grand Theft Auto. And my little brother used to play that, and I was like, "What are you playing?" But yeah, I just had this kind of very ignorant, because I didn't have the experience or hold the relationships to learn, notion of what was involved in game developing and gameplay. And then I've seen these games y'all are making here, and I've heard about other games that are really also here for mental health and emotional health, which is something I would like to also bring to the table during this conversation. Just this like independent world of creation, which I think is really cool. Jonathan, will you tell us a little bit about what accessibility means to you in this space?
Yeah, obviously I'm generally looking at it from the perspective of people with disabilities. And the cost thing is very true, because it is very often very expensive to be disabled. And at the same time, very often your potential income is extremely limited by being disabled. Not a great combination when you want to get into an entertainment form that fundamentally there's a cost to buy it. But on actually making games more accessible, there's kind of, in my mind, 2 most basic categories. You've got an external category where you're coming to the game that is by assistive devices, creating environments and controls so that you enable someone with a disability to play a game that they would not otherwise be able to play. Awesome, that's great, but again, that's kind of an individual by individual basis. So my focus, especially since I'm in an area where there's a lot of video game developers in Austin, is more looking at making the games themselves fundamentally more accessible. And again, that breaks down into 2 categories where you have basically accessibility features. Like there's a menu and you go and you turn subtitles on, you turn subtitles off. You change the difficulty of the game, you shift the color spectrum, enlarge text, all kinds of things are being done. Awesome. But I think that one of the areas that even within the developer community needs to kind of be evangelized more is the other side of it, which is inclusive design, where games are made up largely of barriers. And ideally they're all intentional barriers at the level you intended them to be. But you also can't do that because there's no such thing as a default player. But inclusive design is seeing a barrier and going, oh yeah, we don't actually need that. That's not additive to the game. That just causes problems. And changing it to something else or getting rid of it altogether. So that's changing the game on kind of a more fundamental level. You need a combination of both, but we probably need more focus on inclusive design. Because I still meet people that kind of don't even realize that's part of the process pretty regularly.
And can I say,
Absolutely,
when
yeah.
you started talking about the menu and the features, I was thinking about closed caption, features like that, or, language, different types of languages. Those are all barriers, and those can increase accessibility. And those are features that we don't think about in design. Braille controllers for so we need to, when we say game changing, those are the kinds of innovations that we need for our communities that are not here, right, to speak for themselves. So that's why we advocate for them.
And what's really awesome is that it's been shown in a bunch of studies that basically every time you make a game more accessible, you're not just helping disabled players. You end up with a curve-cutting effect where the game becomes more playable for everybody. I've had specific conversations about, hey, things that were done to make games more accessible for the disabled community made games much more playable for the senior community.
Right.
Or even like the inclusion of dynamic captioning that shows you what direction a sound is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
Like I love first-person shooters. I suck at first-person shooters, but knowing where the sound is coming from on the caption helps a bunch. That's how I beat Far Cry.
Can you describe, I love this, y'all don't need me, I have a question. I'm an audience member. Can you describe what dynamic sound audio captioning is for people in the room who might not know?
Yeah, dynamic captioning is going to mean that when you get your closed caption, it is not just saying the words that are being spoken, it's differentiating who is speaking the words, often through color cues. And then it also details sound, specifically what the sound is, as well as having integrated features that show you where that sound is coming from.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever played, and this can be done in multiple ways, it can be done in the captioning itself, it can be done in the UI. So if you've ever played like Call of Duty or something like that, and you see the blood pop up from the right or left hand side, that's telling you where you're getting hit from, that's telling you where the sound is coming from, that's telling you where everything is going. And I think Ubisoft has done a really good job of integrating those features that help every player, like you said, Jonathan, into kind of a seamless UI that just gives you a better player experience as well.
Well, I think I just saw this actually for the first time this past week in a film. There were like different color captions, and there was a caw coming in. It was like wherever the birdie was, like caw in the film. It was very cool. One of you, Jonathan, you said something that I'm going off script here because it was interesting. I like sticking with the language of inclusive design at the fundamental level. I think that can really be the point of intersection for all of these different identities that you're talking about, that people hold, people come to games bringing with them. But you said there's no such thing as a default player, and I think that's a really important kind of mode of thinking for people in the room who might be designing games or even playing games and looking for folks to play games with. I wonder though if y'all could talk a little bit about who the default player is now, like what the world is like now in gameplay and game. Maybe that's too big of a question.
If I had to say who the default player is, who's paying for it?
Yeah.
The person, the consumer, the purchaser, that's the default player. I mean, if there is such a thing, but like he said, there is no default. There is no default.
Do you think, so do you think this is the same mentality in even like bigger game design? Do you think it's not like they're designed for like white, able-bodied men?
I think when games get designed, I think most of the time you're not getting designed for a default identity, they're getting designed for somebody who likes the genre type. But that also means that you end up losing people who may not come out of the genre type or may love it and not have the ability to traverse it in the same way.
And then if I sit down at the table, okay, who is a novice, a beginner, I may not enter it with where my grandson, he's got to stop and teach me, right? So, we need to think about it.
And there are more and more co-op games coming along that allow you to play at different difficulties with people that are at a higher difficulty. where you can adjust your lives and their lives separately, so you each get your own unique player experience, but you still get to do it together. Disney Illusion Island that's coming out next month is really good at that. I've got to play that, I don't know how many weeks ago now, my brain hurts. But that's a really good example where you can choose to have infinite lives, you can choose to have one life, you can have rope assists, you can help people to get another extra life. And those types of things are like, that's what's being built in. So I don't think there's a default player. I think that they design games for a specific genre. But in that, you end up kind of getting tunnel vision and losing stuff around it.
Well, yes, but generally when I'm speaking about a default player, okay, I'm going to say something that some people might not like deal with, but the big lie is game balance. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. You can only balance a game for an individual. You can't balance a game for all players. So where I'm usually coming out from a default player is their capability to play the game. And beat it, master it, whatever. And the problem is every player, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, is going to start the game with a different capability to play that game. Most players, again, whether they have a disability or not, will have the ability to improve as they play if the game's good and if they want to put in the effort to do so. However, again, every single player is starting at a different point, and every single player has a different skill ceiling. Not everybody can go to the same height. They just can't. So, again, that's why game balance is a lot. You know, eventually, every developer is kind of decide, okay, this is where we're going to be, and these are the options related to difficulty we're going to put in, but it's always going to be an imperfect solution. So you just do the best you can. But this idea that we've unfortunately has gotten stronger in the past decade because of that specific genre, is the idea that, oh no, if you put in the effort, everybody can master this and experience the whole thing, and it's good, and we don't need to actually tailor anything to you. It's just not true. And I really think that unless a developer kind of comes to terms with that, they're going to be on the wrong side of most accessibility related decisions. There's a specific video on YouTube done by Ian Hamilton, who's a UK-based accessibility consultant, advocate, researcher, just called Difficulty versus Accessibility. It's 6 minutes long. I genuinely believe everybody in development should watch it. It does a much better job than me of explaining this and breaking it all down in a way that I think is understandable and convincing. And it will change a lot of people's perceptions and approaches when they're working on stuff, if they can successfully integrate these ideas.
Thank you. Okay, hold on, I have 2 questions. One question is, what is our time like? I know that we were supposed to wrap up at 4:30, but I don't exactly know, like, if we have a few minutes.
We're good.
We're good?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm gonna ask maybe one more question, kind of around the notion of accountability that leads into this space, and then I'm gonna open it up to y'all for questions. I'm just learning a lot, so my brain is also like processing. The question I wanna ask might seem silly, but you know, sometimes when we're talking about these issues of accessibility, there are people who hold in their minds like, why does it matter? Like there's genres that exist, people can access what they like. So I kind of want you to say, you know, you've already said this is why it matters. I'm not gonna repeat you, I want y'all to say answers. But I would love to have some kind of like explicit, here's why it matters, here's why in the development space we consider all these intersections of access. And then potentially offer some thoughts on structures of accountability, if they exist in the development and playing world, and if they don't, what they could look like. Is that too much to ask?
Well, I'll just start with saying statistically, right now, we have a historic statistic in the workplace. We have 5 generations in the workplace. And I think that when you start developing games and you start thinking about that, think about we have 5 generations that are playing games, buying games. That I think we need to start there. That's historic, right? That's opportunity. That's revenue. That's marketing. 5 generations. So when we talk about accountability, those groups should be included. Focus groups, listening groups, you know, we need to include them to get their idea of the you know, the return on their investment, right? That's my answer.
Great. What do you think, Kate? I think for me, and I won't touch on accessibility from a disability perspective, Jonathan do that, and also like I myself too, like I think there's a lot of inaccessibility in the accessibility community, in gaming, primarily because it's usually, if you look up like the GDC panels at Game Developers Conference, it's all done by white folks. If you look up the Xbox Showcase for accessibility, all done by white folks. I don't personally feel comfortable in that space, so I don't have too much input other than what the assists I use. But so far as accessibility from a broader class structure that I've talked about and the way that that inherently affects disabled gamers and inherently affects gamers of color, right now to become a game developer is really hard. A lot of places when they post entry-level positions, it's not 0 experience. They're wanting 3 years of experience. You don't know if somebody's building in Unity, you don't know if somebody's building in Unreal, you don't know if you need C# or C++, and you don't know those nuances of somebody who's trying to get into the market. So from an accountability perspective, and what I do in my job is making sure that when somebody reaches out to me and asks for a resume review or portfolio review, I respond to them and I do it. Because you need to tell somebody who's trying to break into the space, how can I help you get there? And for me, I think that there needs to be more buy-in from the development community and the people who are already in the door to open the door for the people behind them. And a lot of that can be done in different ways. At my company, it's done through building internship programs with different universities. I'm in a really great spot, and one of the reasons I chose to work for the company that I do is we primarily have office locations our studios in the South. People don't think about that as an access point because right now game studios only want to hire in California and Washington. They don't believe the talent is here. They don't believe it's in Texas. They don't believe it's in Tennessee. They don't believe it's in Florida. They don't believe it's in any of these places, but we're here and we're thriving. And so it is at building the pathways for people trying to get into games at any level and showing them how to do it and not just saying, oh yeah, just apply to 10 places. Like, no. Apply to the place that you want. And like, if anybody in this room is trying to start working at an indie studio or working at a studio, look at the studio and the games that they have done. Look at the engine that they have produced it in and make sure that that is the highlight of your resume. Same thing with the code that they're using. And most of them will list that. Like there's little things like that will get somebody's attention. So yeah, for me, it's about building a pathway for the future. And because like right now, people who are at our, like Austin, ZeniMax, Arcane, EA, BioWare, like all these AAA studios here, those doors are very strongly held shut for a lot of people. But there are flourishing indie studios in Austin that you can get your start at. And a lot of those places, if they're like us, are going to be investing in that future in a way that you won't know unless you just send an email and ask. It may sound dumb, but like I have resources that I send people for C++, that's what our studio uses. And I'm like, hey, you know, it's not a fit right now, you don't have the skills, but here is the toolkit that we usually give to our devs to learn how to get the skills to them. That was kind of all over the place, but yeah, that's the accountability structure. Build an actual pathway and tell people how to get there because it hasn't worked to just say, oh, just try.
Well, it was just one thing I wanted to make sure I said, and I think this is the place, the intersection, when she talked about pathways. So it's a statistic I'm about to share that they build prisons based on 4th grade reading scores. So I'm gonna say when you're building games, think about education opportunities. think about communities that need your help in taking them to another level, educationally, experience, and skills, and want to be considered. So those are things I'd like to make sure that I invest here.
Thank you for that. All of our worlds are connected. I'm learning a lot about this world. I also think just as somebody who doesn't have the language of development or like the language of coding for the internet, I'm pretty smart technically. You know, I have like these things that say cultural capital. She's a smart guy. But it's really questions of power is how I think of it. I'm so powerless when it comes to understanding how the internet works, for instance, or like how one would even begin to develop such a beautiful game out there. And I think if we can think in terms of power with all of the positions that we hold as we uniquely arrive at those positions, then it kind of eliminates these structures and how these worlds are actually interconnected. Why it would make a lot of sense to talk about schools and prisons when we're talking about game development. So thank you for that. Jonathan, do you have any offerings for us before questions?
As far as specifically with like disability, accessibility, and gaming, I don't personally feel like there's a lot of external accountability. We are starting to move into an era where certain platform holders are looking at implementing more standards, but we're early days on that, and you know, especially for indie developers where a lot of stuff is going to PC, it's not really going to be a thing. On the other hand, you know, there's always going to be, like, if a game is at all popular, there's going to be plenty of public accountability. If you put a game out and you mess up the subtitles, people are going to let you know loudly, and they should. People still mess up subtitles in 2023. But I mostly try to look at it from a positive things perspective, in that, you know, games make people's lives better. You guys make games. You have the opportunity to make people's lives better. Wouldn't you want to make as many possible people's lives better? It's just that simple to me.
Love that. Okay, love
That's a
that. So now we're gonna open it up to questions until y'all tell me that time is up. I'm officially done keeping time. Does anybody have questions for us? And perhaps I can hand the mic to you instead of asking you to come here, just in case anybody, we're talking about accessibility, in case people need some aid hearing. No questions?
Or maybe you do have to actually come.
But I think, Jonathan, you were talking about this, and you mentioned one particular genre. I'm assuming you're talking about the Dark Souls genre, yeah. And there's that genre, as well as, I guess it's a different one, but like the Getting Over It style, where there's like no checkpoints, and the whole genre type is based on extremely high difficulty, and you have to work to overcome it. It's kind of like it reminds me of like the gym culture, where it's like bulking your way up to where you can lift like 500 pounds or something crazy like that. But it's just very, even for like able-bodied people, it's very intimidating, and it feels like one of those things where there's a culture of the people who go through that strenuous journey that not everybody can embark on to reach that point. And then sort of a culture of pride around it, where like I think those games are interesting, but then when I try to play them, I become very quickly discouraged. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on how developers could design those to where there's still that gameplay perspective of like, oh, you're overcoming this great difficult task or something like that, but make it actually accessible to where you can adjust that to where you're getting the pleasure of doing so, but not at the cost to where it's the same level for everybody.
Again, a lot of that I think comes out of really internalizing the idea that players aren't coming to a game with some preset level of capability. So developers kind of have to let go of being in control of deciding what the challenge is, because you don't know what the level of challenge is to the person coming to play the game on an individual level. So ideally, you just put in as much flexibility as possible. The people, from what I've seen in interviews with people making at FromSoft, they seem to, if they're being honest, they genuinely seem to not get it and think that anybody actually could do this, and don't understand that everybody's starting experience is different, and ending experience is different. Some people coming to those games, it's hard for most people. They're deliberately hard games. But for some people, when they start one of those games, it's a little bit hard. And for other people, it's a nightmare. Those aren't equivalent experiences at all, even at that very beginning. And so I just think that it just doesn't, we're just gonna have one default thing, and we've put in enough tools for everybody to make it work themselves. It's just, no, it's not real.
I'm reminded of how like horror games, they'll put like a brightness bar at the beginning, like adjust it until this is barely visible. There was like a way to do that, but with difficulty. Like this is where you get in like 10 tries or something. Let's adjust it based off of that. That won't be perfect, but it'll be.
You get, we're starting to get in a period where you're starting to see that, and I get wary of using too many AAA examples because a big part of my focus is on indie developers, and I think that since a lot of the coverage on video game accessibility is on the super cool stuff that was in the God of War game or is in the new Spider-Man game, or the Ubisoft, who's done some really cool stuff, but an indie developer sees that and goes, they had 200 people plus on that game, and it was several $100 million, so it would be real easy to get in the mindset that accessibility is super cool, but that's the domain for the people that have all of those resources. I'm not at the level where I can even, it's for everybody. I absolutely understand that everybody has different resources and only so much that they can do. That's true of every game at every level, but everybody has the ability and should be taking accessibility into consideration, whether it's 200 people on a game, 4 people, or 1 person.
I guess I have a, go ahead, what were you gonna say?
Oh, I was gonna say one of the cool things to do is to look at Soulsborne games that aren't from FromSoft. Like there are differences in them. So like I mistakenly took Wolong to review. I did not know it was a Souls game. I was like, this is really beautiful. I died over 60 times in the very first boss. But what I found out I could do is I couldn't save scrum. But I could level myself up by repeatedly defeating enemies so that I was at like level 22 by the time I beat it, and everything just got really easy after. But like there wasn't a restriction in this is the finite amount of things that you can get right here. You can build your character up if that is what you need to do. But you have to look at like, have they removed that barrier? Did they say this is the one linear way? And like, honestly, like the Sultan Sacrifice, I think is another one. Like there are a lot of like games that are Soulsborne that are doing the genre differently that aren't FromSoft. So you don't have to throw out the whole genre, you just have to figure out who's working within it in a way that is looking at individual players coming to it.
And that's called Soulsborne,
Soulsborne, yeah.
just for anybody who's new to.
It's not official, but
yeah,
it's what they call it.
accessibility.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would, however, caution people, because a lot of those games do take the approach that, well, we freely allow you to level up and you can come back to it way more powerful. But that means that one person's experience of the game is, I beat this boss in 20 minutes, and another person's is, it took me 6 hours to be able to do that. That's not it's not equivalent. It's cool that you can. And some people just will enjoy that leveling up process, but it's not a full solution to that kind of problem.
Yeah.
Other things you'll see is like with the Jedi Survivor games, where are not full Soulsborne, but they pull elements of it, and they allow you to adjust the amount of time for your parry window, which has a tremendous impact on the playability of that game.
visual aids as well.
Visual aids,
I
yeah.
think glow long, they glow red, and the moment you have like when you can't adjust it, but it's a visual cue to tell you, oh yeah, you should parry now.
Right. And, yeah, okay, go ahead, did you have a question?
No, they kind of touched on some of it, and I guess not being in the game world, and I just had like from developers and people out there, so we are allowed you to ask us questions, I'm gonna ask you questions. So when you guys are testing and things like that, you know, do you have like a good, better, best process in terms of, because when you guys just described what you just about adjusting and things like that, do you have like a good, better, best kind of testing? Yes.
I mean, so in general, I would say that when you're play testing, you should try to get a wide variety of people with a wide set of skills. People who play games way too much, people who don't at all, and so you can get a broad spectrum of people who are able to do that. Playtesting is a whole thing that you can invest tons of time into, or just breeze right by, but it would be done there. And yeah, so optimally you have some people who play games in a variety of different ways, or various amounts of times about their week. Some people work a job, some people are on summer break and have hours in the day that they can play. And so I think it's just important to figure out what people's circumstances are like, so you can adjust accordingly and allow for as many people as possible to play your game.
Yeah. This is what Game Jaw is for, right? Partly.
Yeah.
You Game Jaw when people come and play.
But game testing is like a really major complication, especially at the indie level, because we have people in our community that they're making a game by themselves in their free time. We have people in small teams. We have people with larger teams, and game testers is in and of itself a precious resource, and not everybody knows how to find people to play their games. Any people, much less trying to find people with various different lived experiences so that they can test for specific different type of areas like diversity and accessibility and disability. So that's a major pain point for making games, specifically in the indie community.
Yeah, I wanted to add, I don't think there's like a standard practice of playtesting how to get the results you want out of it. So I think like something I would want as a developer is like a set of standard practices and a rubric of like what are the things that make your game the most possibly accessible, and what are the sort of systems by which you should test it to see if you're covering a broad range of people. So if you have resources that you recommend, that would be helpful.
Thank you, that's exactly what I was driving.
Building off of that, there was actually an online resource that at least describes the basics, called Game Accessibility Guidelines.
I was about to mention that.
Yeah.
There are multiple ones. That is my favorite. I like it because it's very clear, it's fairly specific, and also it's broken down into essentially like beginner, intermediate, and advanced, as far as like, hey, your resources are this, start here. And and you can build on that as you go along, and if you find you have more resources. We will be adding a place on the Discord where we'll be posting links to various resources that I find, so that you won't have to remember to go there. You'll just be able to check the Discord. That we'll pull that up. So yeah.
Great. And I'm sure if you're not on the Discord, there's a way that people can sign up on the Discord and then have access to these resources, and maybe some of these examples that you shared earlier. It'll be good to have like some games as models. Any other questions?
We just saw a hand back there. Diana?
So, just disclaimer, I'm not in the industry at the moment, but so whenever you're working, especially with time constraints, how you're testing your games changes drastically. So for example, I don't know if everyone knows what game jams are, but basically you make a game with a theme in a very short period of time. So whenever I was working on my last game jam, we said, okay, does it work? Yes, okay, then we try and make it more to what we need it to be. for the players without destroying the entire game. That's what we do our best to do, especially on time constraints. I don't know if that's just because it's on time constraints, but at least in my experience when it comes to testing things with a lot of limited space and with time being a very vital resource, that can really affect how you optimize experiences for as many people as possible.
That makes sense. Have you ever had a game jam where the theme was accessibility?
The one I worked on last one had a theme of roots, so it's more of like a theme of just overall like genre and stuff.
It's been
Okay.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
because that could be a cool way to kind of frame a game jam. It's like you have a limited amount of time, roots and the forest. I don't actually know how these work, but like you have your context and you get going. Thank you for sharing.